Today's video is sponsored by Babbel. With the start of a new year, most of us will make a New Year's resolution of some kind, and naturally, within the next week, we have already broken it and chalk it up to trying again next year. Well, instead of hitting the gym or quitting that drinking habit, how about you do something that can actually benefit you in the long run? Like learning a new language, of course. Babbel is the best language learning app, hands down, and let me tell you why. Babbel actually teaches you real-world, practical conversations that you can use in your day-to-day life. And since most of us nowadays has trouble paying attention longer than 30 seconds, I know, I am just as guilty, Babbel offers short, 10-minute interactive lessons so that attention disorder that you have won't be an issue. The lessons are designed by real language teachers, not some part-time employee who can't even say "Hey, good morning" to their coworkers. And it's not just lessons that Babbel offers. They also come packed with podcasts, videos, and even games. Now, apart from the chance to learn a useful skill for life, Babbel has decided to sweeten the deal for all of my subscribers by giving all of you 65% off of your subscription. Add a 20-day money-back guarantee to top it off, and this offer pretty much sells itself. So, after this video, click the link below for 65% off your subscription today. The old expression of never knowing what you have until it's gone has stood the test of time for obvious reasons. Whether it's a pet, a relationship, or even a loved one. We never fully grasp the impact something has made on us until it is no longer there. This is the case for countless things, and truly something all of us have experienced in one way or another. The family of George Owens were no different when on July 22, 1985, the 79-year-old husband, father, grandfather, and minister disappeared, never to be seen again. With a case spanning more than 30 years and after exhaustive search attempts by law enforcement, the trail of George Owens ended in an area that only left more questions and very, if any, answers. This is the true story of the mysterious disappearance of George Owens. The story starts on July 22, 1985. George Owens was supposed to pick up his wife of 60 years, Eileen Owens. She had returned that morning from a trip to Ohio to visit her niece, and once arriving back home in Nashville, Tennessee, she waited by the bus station, as it was planned that she would be picked up at 6:30 that morning. After waiting over an hour, Eileen, assuming that George had simply overslept, called his brother, Alfred, to get a ride home. Alfred left his house, but before leaving, attempted calling George, yet nobody answered. Once Alfred picked up Eileen and took her back to her home, they both made their way inside, only to notice something was off almost immediately. Eileen and Alfred both quickly noticed that George's car, a 1972 Dodge Dart, was not in the garage. Concerned by this, they went inside and noticed that the table had been set with 2 plates, as if breakfast was soon to be served. George's hat was also left behind, something that according to Eileen was out of the ordinary, as he always wore it anytime he went out. The couple's dog was also starving, and after searching the bedroom, Eileen discovered that one of George's black suits was missing. From an outside observation here, it could simply look like George woke up late and in a rush to go get Eileen from the bus station, he left his hat in the process and possibly forgot to feed the dog. Yet, the table being set for a meal is what stands out the most. I am assuming that George didn't set the table for the next morning the night before, simply because nobody really does that. Yet everything else, his missing suit, his car being gone, could simply be that he had left to go pick up Eileen. Yet, Alfred knew that something wasn't right about this situation and contacted the police shortly after to report a missing person. The authorities arrived at the house and took both statements from Alfred and Aline, but apart from a search of the local area, nothing turned up of the 79-year-old. Fast forward 6 days later, and George's car was located in a remote area in Perry County, over 100 miles from his home in Nashville. When police arrived to examine the car, they concluded that no sign of foul play had occurred. The keys were still in the ignition, and the battery was completely dead. The driver's side window was down, and the back door was left open. His cane was also found to be propped up against the car. Police also discovered his suit jacket inside of the car, along with a pack of matches. Yet, no sign could be found of George Owens. Concern had now grown into full panic for much of the family of George Owens. He was elderly, and on top of that, George was said to have needed his cane to get around. So the fact that it was simply left behind was grave news for much of the family. What also caused Aline to feel an overwhelming sense of dread was the car itself. She said that George loved that car and was meticulous about not only keeping it clean, but taking care of it, fixing scratches or dents within a week of them happening. So, for him to have just left his car behind, with the doors open and the interior of the car exposed to the elements, wasn't something in his nature to ever do. About a week later, a local television station aired a report on the missing husband, and within a day, several tips came in of reported sightings of George. The last known days of George Owens were about to unfold, and at the end of it, a mystery would be born that would continue to this very day. One of the first reported sightings of George Owens was on July 22, 1985, around 9 a.m., the morning that George was supposed to pick up Aline in the day that he was declared missing. By this time, Aline and Alfred had already alerted police of the situation, yet George was reported as being seen along Route 13, nearly 80 miles away from Nashville. He was then reported being seen at a gas station in Santa Fe, Tennessee, where he was getting a flat tire repaired. Before leaving the gas station, George asked for directions to Nolensville, but due to a miscommunication, the gas station owner gave him directions to Lobelville. The next day, on the 23rd, George was seen at another gas station, this time in Lobelville. George then went into a store to purchase cigars, and the woman who was the cashier, Mary Jo Phoebus, recalled her interaction with George. She stated that he seemed very confused, and that he began to tell her that there was an area near that gas station where he used to dance with his wife, and then he began complaining about not being able to find her. Thinking that he was confused, Mary Jo actually called a local clinic to see if on the off chance that Aline was a resident there, and that George had simply forgotten where she was. Yet, Mary Jo was told that there was nobody there by that name, and they had no idea who George even was. He was said to have abruptly left without saying another word. 5 days later, the next clue on George Owens emerged. It was reported that shortly before George's car was discovered by police, that it had actually been seen. Yet, the eyewitness said that the person driving the car did not match George's description. The witness then went on to say that George's car was driven in the direction of the remote area, where it was ultimately discovered. Yet, the car was also closely being followed by a pickup truck. The two cars stayed in the remote area for around 15 minutes, yet no visual recounting of the actual area could be recalled, as the eyewitness only saw the two cars pulling onto the road that led to the remote area. After about 15 to 20 minutes, the truck was seen leaving the area, yet George's car did not. The car would later be found by the police that was previously mentioned in the video. This was the last reported information relating to George Owens, and while very sad that no resolution had been made and no closure could be had by the family, it does bother me how the scene of George's car was found. It led me to do even more digging and put more pieces together, or at the very least, attempt to. The biggest thing that stood out to me here was his cane. The fact that it is said that George needed that cane to walk around, and that according to his wife, he would never walk long distances without it. For that cane to be left at his car, yet no trace of George to be found, leads me to think that he wasn't even driving his car to the remote area. On top of that, with all of his other personal items, such as his suit jacket to be left in the back seat, for his car to be left with the doors open, exposed to nature when he was said to have taken great care of his vehicle, just doesn't sit right with me. Yet, there is another thing that I cannot look past, even if it simply makes things even more confusing. What I am referring to is that when police found the car, there were several pieces of wood found in the back seat, seemingly very out of place, and stumped police as to why George would even put it in his back seat. Aline, however, had an answer for this, as she told police that George had a habit of picking up wood around their house and had done it for years. What I am assuming she means by this is that George was cleaning up his yard, and by wood, I think she means sticks and twigs, which honestly, I could see. I in fact remember seeing my grandfather do this exact same thing as a child, so this is what I instantly thought about when reading about George picking up wood. So if piles of wood were found both around and in George's car, could it have been that George was the one who did it? It would fit his character since Aline reported it was what he did at home. Yet where it doesn't fit is when the eyewitness stated that whoever was driving George's car didn't match the physical description of him. These pile of woods, while appearing as something not super important, does somewhat play into a theory that I have, but I will save that for a little later. The biggest thing here is the most obvious. Where could George Owens have gone? So, in order to do that, let's backtrack to the last reported physical sighting of George Owens. The last physical sighting of George Owens was made by Mary Jo Phoebus. What stood out to most of you was probably George telling Mary Jo that he was looking for his wife, and seeming to get upset that he couldn't find her. I feel that this was the strongest piece of information that gives us a glimpse into the mind of George Owens that day. He was, after all, a 79-year-old man who at the time was more than 100 miles away from his home, and yet he is searching for his wife. Given that he seemed to leave his house in a hurry the previous day, it leads me to believe that George may have been suffering from some form of dementia, or another possible medical emergency. Looking back on the condition of the house are strong contributors to this theory. The fact that the dog was left starving, that the table had been set, that he, in a hurry, left his hat behind, and that when he was supposed to be picking up Aline, he was instead over 60 miles away, driving away from Nashville. The theory for this continues on with the first gas station trip, where George asked for directions to Nolensville, where he mentioned was his hometown. So perhaps he was looking for how to get there since it was a place that he was familiar with, since he clearly had no idea where he was. And he may have even been aware that he was lost and needed to get to a place that he knew. The mistake of the gas station owner mistaking what he said for a different town seemingly appears to just be bad luck. And it all leads back to Mary Jo Phoebus, and George telling her that he was looking for his wife. I think George knew that he was supposed to pick up his wife, but I think he forgot where he was supposed to go. This finally leads to his car being discovered by police and the mysterious truck that followed George's car to the remote area. Now, I personally feel George was in fact driving. I know earlier in the video I said it was somebody else, and I know that the eyewitness said that the driver didn't match the physical description of George. But eyewitness accounts aren't always the most credible, especially given that the vehicle was moving and this witness only saw the driver for a few seconds. The reason that I feel that George was in fact driving was due to the scene of how the car was. With the sticks in several piles around his car, and his cane being left propped up against the car as well, the fact that Aline said the stick thing was normal for George, and then to find piles of sticks around his car is far too coincidental for me. Why the sticks were there is something I don't understand. I don't know if it was due to George thinking he was somewhere near his home, or perhaps it was simply just something he was trying to do to help him focus. Now, the truck that followed George, I truly feel may have had ill intentions. With George's cane being left behind, with the car being left in the condition it was in, was very against George's nature. And if he was remembering the habit of picking up sticks and his hometown, then I could assume that he would remember how tidy he kept his car. Now, granted, there is no proof that foul play happened, but I would love to know why else some random truck would follow him into an isolated area and then stay there for nearly 20 minutes only to leave and leave his car with the doors open. I mean, anyone at that point could have simply helped themselves to whatever was in or even used the car. So if it was a concerned person following George, then why not lock or, at the very least, close the doors? Also, why was the key left in the ignition? To me, that tells me whoever, whether it was George or someone else driving it, left in a hurry. But why did they? And again, that is even if someone else was responsible for George's disappearance. It could simply be that George himself drove to the remote area and simply wandered off into the woods, and due to a possible medical emergency or potential dementia, he may have thought he was somewhere familiar. But if again that was the case, then why did he leave behind his cane? I did see one theory on the subject of the sticks around his car, and it being that someone was possibly trying to set the car on fire. But to me, that really feels like a stretch. There seems to be much easier methods of burning a car rather than just using sticks. But again, that is just how I view it. In the end, however, the mystery of what happened to George Owens will seemingly continue to stay unsolved unless some evidence of his remains are ever found. I feel it is safe to say that given his age in 1985, that as of now, nearly 37 years later, that George Owens is no longer with us. In 1993, he was legally declared dead, and since then, no new updates have emerged about George. If there was anything to be said about this case, I would say that if you are ever in a situation where you see someone needing help, then act on it, instead of thinking that someone else will take care of it, because truthfully, you won't know if someone else ever will. As Mary Jo Phoebus said, looking back on the situation, I wish I had called someone to get help for him, instead of just letting him walk away confused. What we do know from all of this is that on July 22nd, 1985, George Owens was being searched for by his wife Aline, and at the same time, George himself was searching for her. Aline herself died in 1989, never knowing what happened to her husband. I can only hope that now, George and Aline have found each other since then, in one way or another.